time. This approach, promoting fluency with numbers and sequences, is highly recommended for supporting children with their mathematical learning, but not to be done in isolation. This is to be done alongside other practices and approaches for best results. So we're going to look at how we promote fluency with numbers and sequences. We're going to look at where this evidence has come from. What does this practice look like? And how do we actually do it? What do we as adults do in our interactions for this to take place, for the children to become fluent with their numbers and their sequences? So always very useful to go back to our statutory framework that we have to be working towards. We have to bear in mind the statutory framework, and is always a good place to go back to when you're reflecting on your practice or when you're thinking about tweaking something in your practice. So we have it very clearly spelled out here that developing a strong grounding in number is essential. Okay. So that all children develop the necessary building blocks to excel mathematically. So that strong grounding in number has been seen to be the foundational skill for children to have other mathematical understanding. We also know that spatial awareness is incredibly important. Research is telling us that. Oh, sorry, we've got somebody, Heather Green, do you mind going on mute just because?
I'm so sorry.
Okay, we'll have plenty of time for you to come off mute soon. Thank you so much. Children should be able to count confidently, develop a deep understanding of the numbers to 10, the relationships between them and the patterns with those numbers. In order to develop fluency, it's really useful to cap at a certain number so that we do that really interesting foundational work within a certain number. So if we're thinking, okay, with our 2-year-olds, maybe we're looking at up to 5. Yes, many children will be counting beyond, but have we looked at the patterns within that number 5? Have we really become fluent at counting up to and down from? And have we looked at the relationships between them and how to play around with the different numbers within the number? And then extend that to 10 with our nursery children. And with our reception children, we're going to be making sure that they have the foundational knowledge up to 5, and only then build up to 10, and only then go beyond. So we need to be going back. We know that we haven't necessarily worked with all of our children in our reception classes. They may have come from a different setting, so we need to go back and ensure that that foundational knowledge is there. By providing frequent and varied opportunities to build and apply this understanding, such as using manipulatives, including small pebbles and 10 frames for organising counting, children will develop a secure base of knowledge and vocabulary from which mastery of mathematics is built. So very important there, they're talking about the vocabulary being well chosen and specific and clear, and that need to do things in a real way with manipulatives, to be handling things to give meaning to those numbers and those amounts. So, quick little recap there of our statutory framework, and now we are moving on to the EEF evidence story, because if we wish to be evidence informed in our approaches, this is a great place to look at practice and look clearly at different approaches that are supported by educational research. The interpreting has been done for us, so we can go straight in to see what those evidence-informed approaches are. We then will interpret those and make them applicable to our practice and our settings and our set of adults. So these first two approaches, teaching the association between number and quantity and promoting fluency with numbers and sequences, are very, very connected. Obviously, we will be aiming to get our children to be fluent with the recognition of the numerals, but alongside that, we want the children to know what those numerals represent. So we want them to have that knowledge of the association between that numeral and its amount. Alongside that, we're also promoting that fluency of being able to say the numbers in sequence. So if you want a really great resource to help break down how cardinality and counting is learnt sequentially, have a look at the National Centre for Excellence in Teaching Mathematics, because they have these wonderful charts that show the progression. This is what they look like. They're shared as PDFs at the bottom of the pages for each of the strands of mathematics. So if you want to delve deeper, do have a look there. They're really, really useful charts. And they also go through what the common misconceptions are in that particular area of mathematics. It can be very helpful in supporting you in what you notice and what you observe in your children. So on to looking at what this is like in practice. We're going to see a few pictures from our nursery setting at Charles Dickens Primary School. We have a few generic pictures of babies because we haven't yet got consent from our existing babies to use their images. And see if you can glean some ideas from these examples. It may make you reflect on things that you're already doing and things that you can add in. So an example of fluency with numbers is recognizing the numerals 0 to 10 when they're not presented in order. So if we're assessing children in this area, we would not have the numerals in order to truly assess whether they recognize those numerals, because our children are very clever at using scaffolds of order and sequence to support them. And children are very quick to pick up that they can count along the number line to point out the numeral that you're wanting them to represent or to notice. Here we have a child who's taken a numeral out of sequence. He knows that it represents 3, and then he has then chosen 3 objects. Now, if we look at this sequentially, we may have numerals in order because we know the child's not quite fluent in noticing what each numeral represents in isolation. So we're giving them that scaffold of putting them in order so they have a chance to succeed. Only once we know they're quite confident are we going to present those numerals out of order. You might have a few numerals around. You might want to start with just the 1 and the 2 and the 3 to bring it down. We know that a lot of children get their 5 and their 2 muddled. Is there a way that you want to present things so that you avoid that muddle earlier on in your term, perhaps? So do think about how you're presenting things in a way that's digestible for the majority of your children, rather than for those who very excitingly have understood quite a lot, or your child who's neurodiverse, who knows their numerals through and through. How is it that you're going to get them to understand the mastery within that amount? All very challenging questions, but things to think about. here our child has chosen a group of 3 objects of the same type. That is a first step when you're making groupings. Later, you reinforce the amount by having objects of different types and of different sizes. So at what point do you present that in a way that is not going to scare your child away or bring in misconceptions? You want to do that in such a way that it's fun, it's friendly, and they feel like they're succeeding. An example of fluency with sequence is being able to say the counting sequence both forwards and backwards in the correct order. So this might be when you're simply chanting numbers. You're not necessarily counting. And we do a lot of chanting of numbers when we're very young, and that's not necessarily connected to an action or a point or a movement of an object. That's also very valid in order to develop that fluency with the sequence. But remember, you want to be doing it backwards as well as forwards. And here we have the example of children who've put the phone numerals in order from 0 all the way up. They've reached 7 here, and they found multiple of the same numeral, and they found a way of stacking those together. And it's something that they're doing in the continuous provision. So they're revisiting information that's being taught to them, maybe in a little group, and they're excited about revisiting that idea and notion. Common misconceptions that we may find are the children missing out an object as they count. They might count an object twice. They might know that there is a group of cars that's already been counted. And then they go back to count them all over again because they're not aware of what a group is. When asked to get 5 oranges from a tray, the child just takes a whole group rather than counting them out. They bring an approximate amount, and that's when you can use that language of, oh, wow, you've made an estimate. Let's check and see if we really do have 4. When asked other challenges, the children may come up with all sorts of wonderful ideas that make you realize that they're thinking in a different way to how you expected them to think. So just be very open and aim to notice how it is that your child is thinking. When objects in a group are rearranged, the child may recount them from the start because they're not aware that that object hasn't changed in amount because you haven't taken anything out or put anything in. You've simply rearranged. So that idea that there is no change there can be really challenging for children at the early stages. Difficulties in counting back from are often difficult for children. Sorry, that should be slightly smaller font there. This has all come from the NCETM website. Promoting the fluency of numbers. Yes, those key findings in the research do say that this is definitely an area that we should be teaching alongside other things because it does make a difference. Practicing and repeating the count sequence or matching a number word or name with a number symbol can support children's maths development. And if we're providing this approach equally for all of our children, we just need to be making sure that the children that have the widest gaps, who have the greatest difficulty in this area, are perhaps getting more one-to-one support or more small group support, because this approach has been seen to be great universally, but we want to be making sure we're making a really big difference for the children who need our support the most. Seeing pattern and order definitely relates to this approach. There are children who are very attracted to pattern, and like this child here who's making a little tower with his magnetic blocks, he is making a repeated pattern. There's a pattern and a sequence in this, and also there's an amount that you can refer to. So there are many different mathematical layers to what he is choosing to do in this continuous provision situation. So he's got something that he's very attracted to putting in order. That's something to think about. Gems are also very attractive to group in amounts. Another thing that's useful to consider. Routines have been seen to be very useful in the educational research that's been looked at. When, as practitioners, we weave in the use of maths in our routines, we are revisiting those ideas regularly, and it's that repetition and that revisiting and the idea that it is needed. It's a thing that we need to do to organize our world. We need to know how many children are around this table so that we know how many cups we're going to be using, and we can involve the children in supporting us with the count and doing that very explicitly. And the nice thing about cups is that you can make the sound of the cup touching the table and only then saying the count. That really helps children in their initial stages of one-to-one correspondence, when they can hear the object making contact. That might be a stone plopping into a box. It might be the cup meeting the table. But that's something that's very useful to consider when you realise your child needs support with one-to-one correspondence, understanding that one numeral is said per object that is seen or moved. And you'll notice as well that you have to be really precise with your language. And that is really a great thing to do with your children. Actually teach them how to be really accurate in their counting and use that language of accuracy. Children really enjoy being really precise. Practicing and repeating the count sequence or matching a number word with a number name or symbol can support children's maths development. And we've gone through this previously, but here you can see it in a different situation. It's again in the continuous provision. It's a different type of resource where you're almost reading the numerals, but you also get that lovely notion of, I can see that there are more numerals here, so I'm actually able to count the numerals as well as count that number of objects in a bowl. And you can present these things as challenges. If you've made number lines with your children in a small key worker group, for instance, or maybe even in a larger situation, in reception, typically you may be with a whole group of the whole class of 30. If you demonstrate making number lines and set that as a challenge, the children are more likely to go around in the continuous provision and find it really exciting to do things like that. You can see here some of the numerals have been pegged up and put in correspondence with the ladybird that has that many spots on it. And there are all sorts of ways that you can involve the children in these really precise activities and the creation of some of the resources as well. You can have number lines where there's a dangling string and the children attach the amount of objects needed with pegs or perhaps with knots, depending on the skills that they've learned. The research also tells us that board games are seen to be highly beneficial in reinforcing the sequence, the ability to say the numbers in sequence, and be aware that one step is equivalent to one amount. 4 steps is equivalent to 4 the movement, and also there's so much there around measures as well that you can bring in if your child is able to take on that information as well. You don't want to overload with a child who's at the initial stages. With board games, they noted that it was those that had numerals and jumps in a linear fashion that had the best results in supporting children with their fluency, rather than numerals that were presented in a spiral or in a circular form. So that's something to consider here. It's a very simple snail game, which is really quite perfect for nursery aged children. You might want to extend that in a reception class to a board that has more jumps on it. When we're thinking about those earlier stages, actually so much of what a baby is learning to do is through their body, and it is their physical development that is the huge focus. Whilst they are developing physically, they're noticing different parts of their bodies, and just that noticing it's there, it's not there, is a highly mathematical concept. That idea of finding your feet, oh, I have one foot and then I have another, and the caring adult using very simplified language to add to that, simply 1, 2, and I've got your feet. The baby then is tuning in to those words. You keep using them. I wonder why you keep using them. They're going to not be completely new words once they do start absorbing language. But that idea of being there and then not being there is super mathematical. And think about having number songs that a caring adult is singing with the child. You might move parts of the body whilst you sing the lovely rhymes that we have for the fingers of the hands or the fingers of the feet. Later, you might add props to reinforce that we have one fewer as we go through a song. Having numerals around early brings interest to these digits. Having board books that are around numbers that you can point to groups of different types of objects are really nice ways of introducing a baby early to the concepts of maths. You might introduce things like the dandelion clock, where you blow as many times as you need to for the seeds to all disperse. And this was a way to tell the time, and it's a fun little game you can do with the children. Using insert puzzles is a really nice way to reinforce all sorts of mathematical concepts. I really like the use of the box with large objects. That's when you can limit how many things can go into the box if you want to reinforce that idea of 2. The idea of taking from a larger amount and eating and emptying, the hand emptying of all the raspberries is also incredibly mathematical and something to consider what we're doing with our very, very young children a lot of the time. This is an example of a 2-year-old who's doing a very simple game that has been introduced at a little key worker group. It's really fun. They're organising natural resources, trying to get 3 in a row. There's another child having a go with a slightly different circular resource. And here we're able to reinforce 3, and actually the children picked it up really quickly. The adult made a quick 9 frame on a piece of paper. Some of us have really beautiful wooden 5 frames, 10 frames, but don't be afraid to just make up your own. This is a 10 frame that's been made on the spur of the moment and quickly photocopied because there weren't any in that reception class in that moment. And so this gave the children an opportunity to arrange 5 and to really consolidate what 5 is, how it looks on a 10 frame. All sorts of conversations came from this very simple activity where the children were having reinforced in the continuous provision something that they'd learnt in a whole class session around the number 5 and the amounts within 5, and they got a chance to experiment with that, and lots of rich conversations came from this activity. And I always say it's a really good idea to use the language, what do you see? If you're using such an open-ended question, you're going to be quite surprised by some of the responses from the children who may see something that you absolutely didn't predict, and it will usually tell you something very interesting about their way of thinking about amounts, numerals, or maths in general. Here you might have a child who says, well, I can see 1. That's what I see. I see 1 block. And that's a very valid point. And what else might you see? And this is where you can scaffold at an appropriate level, because if your child is only confident to talk about the oneness of 1, you can then be the person to point out, oh, but how many blue ones are there? Shall we have a check together? Because they're not quite ready to say that themselves. All sorts of lovely, rich conversations to be had. Looking at multiple approaches is a good idea because the researchers tell us that they didn't look at this in isolation. Promoting fluency needs to be done alongside other things that you're doing mathematically. It could be that you're looking at the correspondence between the numeral and the amount, which we briefly touched on earlier, which this child is doing. He is highly fluent because he has put these numerals out of sequence and he is putting in the correct amount of objects to represent that numeral. And that's the stage that he's at. The other approaches that you could be looking at are developing mathematical language. That's been supported by lots and lots of research, but do have a look. And also in subsequent network meetings, we'll look more closely at the individual approaches. And then eventually you need to be putting all of those together. So the concluding notes here are that the approach of promoting fluency with numbers is backed by evidence, with numbers and sequences, and should be used alongside other approaches to have maximum effect. We've also seen that the resources you choose, the environment that you set up, and the interactions that you have all play their part in supporting fluency with numbers. It's really important that we don't make assumptions. It's an area that most of our practitioners feel most confident in, getting our children to count things out, to develop their one-to-one correspondence. But there is a sequence that is optimal in how to do this. And we always need to be identifying those children who are struggling and working with those children most so that they can catch up and so that the teaching that we deliver universally is more likely to be remembered by those children. A bit of prior teaching, so maybe talking about the numerals with a child that's struggling with recognizing certain numerals before a session that they're going to have in an adult-led type situation is going to go a long way to supporting them. And then perhaps a recap at the end in the continuous revision, finding an opportunity to revisit that same language and that same concept with the children who are struggling most. That's going to make the biggest difference. So how are you promoting fluency in your setting? I want you to think about the resources that you have. Do a sort of mini audit in your head, and then maybe when you go back tomorrow, these are useful things to be auditing more thoroughly. Are the children interested in counting out these resources? Is it the way we're presenting them? Do we need to have an environment where they can easily set up a shop, where there is a need for having a particular amount of objects? Is there more that we could be adding into our routine so that we're regularly revisiting the sequence of numbers? Is there something we could be doing in our interactions with regard to open-ended questioning or types of challenges that we are presenting to our children? I have also put this slide in because it's highly connected. If you're in a nursery setting, we have this wonderful resource. It's a program called Maths Champions that looks exactly at some of the things that we've talked about today. And if you feel you want to do more work in your practitioner knowledge around maths, around your use of vocabulary, your use of resources, and your environment, this is a great place to start. It is a big commitment. You need to have a lead, and you also need to have a deputy, who then become the maths champions to cascade information across the team. This QR code takes you to an expression of interest form that is connected to our hub. You'll receive these slides, so you'll have that again, and I'm sure Nicola has been emailing this